Looks like the U.S. Senate is going to get a chance to override Trump's veto of their war powers resolution on the war in Yemen next week. After years of not looking at the issue, the Senate decided to bring up a war powers resolution, which passed by a vote of 54 to 46, demonstrating their opposition to the U.S. involvement in the conflict. It would seem as though if until recently there was very little knowledge about the war in Yemen amongst the 100 U.S. senators, although that's to be expected considering that the national security state is essentially left to its own devices to run itself, and the executive branch has little to no supervision in the field of international relations. I'm sure that there isn't one senator who could name even 1/10 of the over 200 countries that the U.S. military is currently operating and fighting in combat in. Although there's no question to me that at this very moment, the most destructive action of the national security state is their involvement in Yemen. So I'm glad that it at least got some attention and that this resolution was at least brought up for a vote. Now, of course, President Trump vetoed the resolution because it was a resolution against his actions and also the actions of Barack Obama, though I'm sure the Democratic senators wouldn't want to bring that up. But the whole war powers resolution system really is useless because not only does this resolution opposing the executive branch's involvement in a conflict have to pass both houses, but then it can just be vetoed by the president anyways. But of course, once the president does veto a bill, it isn't necessarily just thrown right out. There is the possibility that the legislative branch could override his veto, which is what we're going to see next week. But of course, this is completely unrealistic because it would take a 2/3 majority in the House and the Senate, and you're never going to find 67 senators who are opposed to any war, particularly a war when there aren't that many Americans dying and in which the PR fight really is non-existent. I've seen probably enough mainstream media stories which presented the war in Yemen in an unfavorable light for the U.S. I could probably count them on one hand. There was one story by CNN International, not even CNN, which was tracking the bombs used in Yemen back to the factory in, I believe it's Tucson, Arizona, where Raytheon makes a lot of bombs. And that was a pretty good story, but it was one story, and it appeared on CNN International, and it was on a Saturday in the middle of the day. So there's pretty much a complete media blackout on the war in Yemen. They know that criticizing the national security state is not a very good thing to do if you're a national security reporter. The media is totally in bed with the war state. That's why they employ so many of their former comrades, people like John Brennan and James Clapper, and even low-level people who can barely be called intelligence officers like Malcolm Nance are given the red carpet treatment on networks like CNN and MSNBC. They're allowed to spout their propaganda uncritically, day in and day out, which is frankly a large part of the reason why the American people are so ignorant and so complacent when it comes to these issues. There really is there's seemingly no understanding amongst the average American that it is the intel community who attracts all of the domestic terror that we've seen in this country. Unfortunately, most people lap up the lie that al-Qaeda terrorists on 9/11 decided to crash planes into the Twin Towers because they hate our freedom, rather than admitting that the men who join organizations like al-Qaeda and ISIS are inspired to take up arms against Americans, to try and inflict pain on American people because of their grievances with the national security state. The U.S. foreign policy has been intimately involved in trying to craft the region of the Middle East since, frankly, the Carter administration. And every year, more and more people die at the hands of U.S. foreign policy, and that creates more and more people who seek to exact their revenge upon the American people and to avenge their family members. I can only imagine how many generations of terrorists have been created just by the drone war alone that was started largely by Barack Obama and continued by Donald Trump. The drone, which has been one of the top weapons of choice for the U.S. in Yemen, has a tendency to wipe out whole families. This is the case because they often target individuals who they're looking to assassinate when they are attending some kind of social gathering like a wedding or a family picnic. And of course, these are, Middle East Islamic families that are very conservative, so they tend to have very big families. This isn't just a simple American nuclear family where you have a husband, a wife, and 2 kids. This is a husband or wife, two grandparents on each side, all the brothers and cousins. So these airstrikes kill an exponential number of civilians relative to the number of actual targets that the U.S. is looking to take out. And that's assuming that these are men who deserve to 100% be murdered and assassinated. It's not like they've undergone any sort of trial or anything. We have no idea how many mistaken identities there have been, considering that SWAT teams in the U.S. often break down the wrong door when they're looking to do their drug raids. I wouldn't be shocked if the U.S. Has a pretty high failure rate when it comes to bombing the wrong picnic. Now, if these people have to live in fear of their lives every day, wondering whether there might be a drone or a Saudi fighter jet that has decided to bomb their picnic and to murder their entire family, I don't know what to call that other than terror. Yet that is exactly what the U.S. supports when they support the war in Yemen. And of course, not only that, it gets much worse. It turns out that in this case now, even though the U.S. Prior to the Yemeni civil war had been droning al-Qaeda targets in Yemen and killing them and lots of their family, now the U.S. is helping out al-Qaeda and bombing al-Qaeda's enemies and killing their families. It gets very confusing, but basically the sides have switched now in Yemen. Then the U.S. has decided that al-Qaeda are the lesser of 2 evils because at least al-Qaeda is allied with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is our greatest ally. And so to help the Saudis, the U.S. is maintaining their jets because, of course, the Saudis don't really have any mechanics who can work on F-16s over there. We're selling them the bombs, and we're also helping them pick out targets so that they can decide which picnics and which children's schools they want to strike next. Did a story a few weeks ago in which the Saudis bombed a gas station, and of course that created a pretty huge explosion, and it hit a children's hospital, which happened to be next door to the gas station. Now, any idiot could have calculated this. If you bomb a gas station, you probably have a pretty good chance of setting off some kind of explosion when the fuel ignites. But frankly, I don't think the Sauds were just stupid in this case. They probably just didn't care. Of course they didn't care because they're a bunch of evil jerks. I could ramble on about the terrible tragedy that is the U.S.'s support for the war in Yemen all day if I wanted to, but I really should stop and wrap this up. So back to the Senate's chance to override the veto for the War Powers Resolution. Congress essentially has abdicated all authority on making war to the president. There's no reasonable way for the Congress to actually control foreign policy through their constitutional war-making powers. Thanks to the War Powers Act, the president essentially has the affirmative right to make war, and then if Congress wants to stop him, they essentially have to have a 2/3 majority of both houses. Congress's war-making power is transformed from a right to make war to a right to stop war. But of course, with a 2/3 majority threshold required to override a veto of a War Powers Resolution, that essentially means that there will never be any war that is stopped. Any U.S. president really can start any war he wants, and you're probably not going to be able to get 2/3 of both houses to override that sort of a decision. War is just much too popular in Washington. Everyone wants to look tough. Everyone wants to look like they're tough on the enemy, whoever the enemy happens to be that day. This is, frankly, at this point, it's just bureaucratic inertia. The wars will continue that have been started, and new wars will be started as the years drag on. And the only thing that can stop the war state at this point, as far as I see it, would be a complete financial collapse. So long as the federal government has the ability to continue financing these wars, this destructive foreign policy will continue on unabated. The only other solution would be somehow electing a president who understands these issues and is actually opposed to the war state. But that would be extremely difficult considering that they would have to rage against the bipartisan consensus. Trump during the campaign seemed to come close to this sort of position, but I think that he was bullied enough by the media and by the bipartisan consensus about the whole Russia stuff and being called a Russia troll, that he felt the need to be especially hawkish. Even if during the campaign he admitted that most of these wars were dumb and then it made no sense for the U.S. to get involved in Syria or any of these other places. But as far as I have seen, it's truly impossible for an anti-war candidate to get through any major party's primary, considering that both parties are strongly committed to the national security state as a whole. And of course there's the issue that American voters simply don't care because the national security state doesn't affect them that much, or so they think. They sadly do not realize that pretty much all the hatred in the world directed towards Americans is as a result of the actions of the national security state. People who hate America typically hate the CIA. They hate NATO. They hate JSOC. If these organizations did not exist, if they were not carrying the American flag and waging their wars of aggression in the name of the American people, well, then there probably wouldn't be that much hatred for Americans. Americans would probably be thought of just the same as Mexicans or Brazilians or Indians or Vietnamese. We could be just a normal country with normal relations. But sadly, since 1945, that's never been the case. But anyway, if you got anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, make sure to click the bell because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I guess I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.